Learn English through story. The dangerous flame. Nestled between the towering peaks of the Everfrost Mountains and the vast, whispering forests of Eldenmoor, the kingdom of Valastria stood as a beacon of prosperity. It was a land rich in history, with grand castles, bustling marketplaces, and scholars who recorded the wisdom of the ages. But what made Valastria truly unique was the Tower of Oldoria, an ancient stone monolith at the heart of the capital. At its summit burned the dangerous flame, a mystical fire, said to be a gift from the gods. The flame was eternal, never dimming, never flickering, and untouched by wind or rain. Its glow was unnatural, sometimes blue, sometimes golden, as if alive. Legends spoke of its power. Those deemed worthy could harness its strength, but those driven by greed would be consumed by it. Many rulers had dared to touch the flame, and most had vanished from history, leaving behind only whispers of their downfall. King Altharion, the ruler of Valastria, had long feared the flame. He knew its temptations and had sworn never to seek it. But he was old now, his body weakened by time, and he worried about the future of his kingdom. His only son, Prince Kael, was strong, but reckless, too eager for power, too impatient to rule with wisdom. And then, one fateful day, a stranger arrived. Velen came as a traveler, but his presence was unlike any other visitor the kingdom had seen. He was tall and lean, with sharp grey eyes that held the weight of forgotten knowledge. His clothes bore no markings of a known land, and his voice was deep, calm, and persuasive. He spoke of secrets lost to time. He whispered of empires that had risen and fallen, because they did not understand the power they sought. And he spoke of the dangerous flame not as a curse, but as a tool. The flame is not evil, he told the court during a royal gathering. It is not cursed, nor does it punish without reason. Those who understand its true nature can wield it. The gods do not guard it jealously. They wait for one bold enough, wise enough to take it. Kael listened. The young prince had always resented his father's hesitance. He saw Altharion's wisdom as fear, his patience as weakness. For years, he had studied combat, strategy, and governance, but he always felt that something was missing. He craved something greater, and now, Velen had offered him an answer. Kael sought out Velen in secret, in the dark halls of the castle, away from prying ears. The prince demanded to learn the truth about the dangerous flame. Can it truly be mastered? Kael asked. Velen smiled. Anything can be mastered, young prince. But mastery requires sacrifice. Kael's heart pounded. He had heard the legends. Those who touched the flame either perished or vanished, their names erased from history. What must I sacrifice? Velen tilted his head. You will not know until you take it. The answer haunted Kael, that the hunger in his heart was greater than his fear. And so, under the cover of night, he ascended the Tower of Oldoria. The spiral staircase leading to the summit was ancient, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. At the top, a great iron door awaited, inscribed with warnings in a forgotten tongue. Kael hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The chamber beyond was small, with walls of black stone. In the center, on a raised pedestal, burned the dangerous flame. It was beautiful, its colors shifting like liquid gold, its glow hypnotic. It pulsed as if alive, as if it knew he was there. Kael stepped forward. He could feel its warmth, but it did not burn. Instead, He felt a rush of energy, a whisper in the back of his mind. "Take it." He reached out. The moment his fingers touched the fire, pain exploded through him. But it was not ordinary pain, it was a flood of power. Visions, knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. He saw past rulers, those who had fallen, those who had succeeded, and those who had been erased from time itself. He saw what the flame truly was. Not a gift, not a weapon, but a hunger. Kale staggered back, his body shaking. He was stronger. He could feel it, his senses sharper, his reflexes quicker, his mind clearer. But something was wrong. The hunger was there now, deep inside him. A whispering voice that told him he could do more, be more, if he only embraced the flame further. At first, no one noticed the change. Kale was more confident, more decisive. He commanded with an authority he had never possessed before. His father, though wary, was relieved. The court praised him. The people saw him as a leader. But Velen knew the truth. "The fire has marked you," he told Kale. "It will not let go." Kale scoffed. "I control it." Velen only smiled. Days turned to weeks, and the hunger grew. Kale became restless. He no longer needed sleep, yet he felt exhausted. He could hear thoughts that weren't his own. His hands trembled when he was alone. But in the presence of others, he radiated confidence. He craved more. He ascended the tower again. This time he did not hesitate. He let the flame consume him further. And then he changed. His strength grew monstrous, his mind sharper than ever. But his humanity slipped away. He no longer felt empathy. He no longer saw friends or family only obstacles or tools. He accused his father of weakness. He dismissed advisors who warned him. He silenced those who spoke against him. And then, on the darkest night of the year, he declared himself king. Altharion, old and weary, faced his son. "The flame does not serve you, Kale. You serve it." Kale laughed. "You are blind, old man." And he struck down his father. For a time, Kale ruled. He was unstoppable, his mind sharp, his strength unmatched. But the hunger never left. He became paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow. He trusted no one, not even Velen. He sought the flame again and again, each time giving it more of himself, until there was nothing left. One night, he ascended the tower for the last time. No one knows what happened. Some say the flame devoured him. Others say he became part of it, his soul forever trapped within its glow. But by morning, Kale was gone. Only the dangerous flame remained, burning as it always had, waiting for the next fool to think they could control it. Power is never truly owned, it is borrowed at a cost. Those who seek greatness without wisdom will find themselves consumed by the very thing they chase. True strength lies not in taking, but in knowing when to walk away. The flame had burned for 1,000 years. It stood atop the tower of Aldoria, untouched by wind or rain. An eternal beacon that pulsed with colors beyond mortal understanding. Some claimed it was a gift from the gods, a fire that granted strength and wisdom to those worthy of its power. Others whispered that it was a curse, a hungry force that devoured all who dared to claim it. King Altharion had spent his life resisting the flame's call. From the high balcony of his castle, he gazed at the tower, its dark stone walls rising against the twilight sky. The flame flickered in the distance, golden and blue as though watching him in return. He had seen its effects firsthand. His grandfather, King Varith, had touched the flame in his youth. Varith had returned stronger, sharper, more cunning than before. And then he had vanished. No one spoke of what happened to him. The official records claimed he had died peacefully in his sleep. But Altharion knew better. He had read the hidden texts, the old scrolls buried in the royal archives. Those who took from the flame always paid a price. The whispers of the past haunted him. But tonight, his thoughts were heavier than usual. Father? Altharion turned to see his son, Prince Kael, stepping onto the balcony. The boy knew. The man was nearly his equal in height now. His dark hair tousled by the evening breeze. His features were sharp, his jaw set with determination. There was fire in his eyes, the kind of fire that worried Altharion. "You summoned me?" Kael asked, his tone polite but impatient. Altharion studied his son carefully. "Walk with me." Kael fell into step beside him as they moved through the marble halls of the palace. "You will be king soon," Altharion said after a long silence. "It is time we speak of the flame." Kael's expression remained unreadable. "You've always warned me against it, and I will warn you again," Altharion said. "Many rulers have sought its power, and none have controlled it. It does not serve those who touch it, it takes from them." Kael exhaled sharply. "And yet, our enemies grow stronger. Our allies question your strength. The world does not wait for a hesitant king, father. If the flame can make me stronger, should I not consider it?" Altharion stopped walking. He turned to face his son, searching his eyes for any trace of doubt. There was none. "You are not ready," Altharion said firmly. Kael clenched his jaw, his frustration clear. "Then when will I be? When I am old and feeble like you?" Altharion's gaze darkened. "I have ruled for 30 years without the flame. Strength is not measured by power alone, but by wisdom and restraint." Kael's fists tightened at his sides, but he said nothing. Altharion sighed. "Promise me, Kael. Promise me you will never seek the flame." Kael hesitated for only a moment. "I promise," he said. But Altharion heard the lie in his voice. The foreigner arrived at dusk, wrapped in a cloak of deep blue, his hood casting a shadow over sharp, knowing eyes. He entered through the southern gate, unnoticed by most. Save for a few beggars and merchants who felt the weight of his presence. By the time he reached the capital square, his name had already begun to spread. Velen. A scholar, some said. A sorcerer, others whispered. A man of forgotten knowledge, with secrets buried in the ruins of the old world. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of prophecy. When he entered the royal court, the nobles quieted. "I come with knowledge," Velen said, his voice deep and calm. "Knowledge of the flame." Altharion sat on his throne, his fingers tightening around the gilded armrests. He had spent his life shielding Valestria from the temptation of the dangerous flame. And now, this man had come to unravel everything. "The flame is not what you believe it to be," Velen continued. "It is not a curse. It does not destroy without reason. It only requires understanding." Kael listened from the side of the throne room, his heart pounding. No one had ever spoken of the flame in this way. Velen's gaze flickered toward him for the briefest moment. It was enough. Kael knew then that his destiny had changed. The halls of the palace had never felt so quiet. Prince Kael moved like a shadow through the corridors, his boots barely making a sound against the polished marble floors. The lanterns flickered as he passed, casting elongated shapes on the walls, ghostly silhouettes that seemed to stretch toward him, grasping. The words of Velen had not left his mind. Asterisk. The flame is not a curse. It only requires understanding. For years, Cale had been warned of the dangerous flame. He had listened, obeyed, but always questioned. If it were truly evil, why had the gods allowed it to remain? If it destroyed all who sought it, why did it still burn, eternal and untouched? There had to be more to the story. The heavy oak doors of the library loomed before him. He pressed his palm against the cool wood and pushed. The hinges groaned slightly, but the vast chamber inside remained undisturbed. The scent of aged parchment and ink filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of candle wax. The shelves stretched high, filled with tomes older than the kingdom itself. Cale moved with purpose, his fingers trailing along the spines of books he had read 100 times before. History, politics, war strategy, everything his father had permitted him to study. But he was searching for something forbidden. His hand stopped on a black leather-bound book, its cover worn with age. No title marked it, but Cale knew it contained what he sought. He pulled it free and set it on a wooden table near the dim glow of a lantern. With careful hands, he turned the brittle pages. The text was written in the old tongue, but he had studied enough to understand. Asterisk. The first king touched the flame and became more than mortal. He saw beyond time, beyond flesh. But power has a price, and the gods do not grant without taking. Cale's breath quickened. The book spoke of those who had sought the flame before rulers, scholars, warriors. Some had risen to greatness. Others had vanished, their names erased from history. But what if those who had failed simply lacked the knowledge to wield it properly? What if he could succeed where others had fallen? You are not the first to ask those questions. Cale stiffened, his hand reaching instinctively for the dagger at his waist. He turned to find Velen standing in the doorway, his dark cloak barely visible against the shadows. How did you... You sought knowledge, Velen interrupted, stepping forward. And knowledge answers when it is called. Cale hesitated, but then released the dagger's hilt. You knew I would come here. Velen smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Of course. The foreigner moved closer, his grey eyes scanning the open book. The flame does not destroy, he said, running his fingers along the text. It reveals. It tests. It offers power to those who dare to claim it. My father says it cannot be controlled. Your father is afraid. Valen's voice was smooth, certain. He has spent his life fearing something he does not understand. But you are different. Cale swallowed. The hunger in his chest, the longing for something greater, it had always been there. Now, for the first time, someone saw it. Someone understood. Velen closed the book. Come with me, Prince Cale. If you wish to know the truth, I will show you. Cale glanced at the towering shelves, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Then he looked at Velen, calm, composed, unshaken. For a moment, his father's voice echoed in his mind. Asterisk. Promise me you will never seek the flame. But the promise had been a lie. Cale extinguished the lantern and followed Velen into the dark. The city of Eldoria slumbered beneath a sky thick with rolling clouds. A lone raven circled above, cutting through the stillness of the night. Below, in the deepest corridors of the palace, Prince Kale followed Velen through the hidden passageways, his pulse quickening with each step. The path was unfamiliar, the air damp with the scent of old stone and forgotten secrets. He had lived in this palace his entire life, yet he had never known these tunnels existed. "Where are we going?" Kale asked, his voice hushed. "Somewhere your father dares not look," Velen replied. They emerged into a vast underground chamber, the walls lined with shelves of scrolls and books, more ancient than the kingdom itself. At the center of the room stood a pedestal of obsidian, its surface etched with symbols Kale did not recognize. A single candle flickered atop it, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "This is where knowledge was hidden," Velen said, gesturing to the shelves. "Your ancestors feared what they could not control. But fear is the weapon of the weak." Kale stepped closer, his fingers grazing the edges of the pedestal. The symbols pulsed beneath his touch, faintly warm. Velen watched him carefully. "You feel it, don't you?" Kale swallowed. "What is it?" "A fragment of the flame's power," Velen said. "A mere whisper of what awaits in the tower. But even this is enough to change a man." Kale's hands trembled, but he did not pull away. The warmth seeped into his skin, his blood, his bones. A strange clarity filled his mind, sharpening his thoughts, heightening his senses. "It's calling to you," Velen murmured. "Do you wish to understand it?" Kale nodded, though the rational part of his mind screamed for caution. Velen extended a hand, pressing 2 fingers against Kale's forehead. The world around him disappeared. Kale stood in a place that was not the chamber, not the palace, not even the world he knew. The sky burned with an unnatural light, shifting between gold and blue. The air crackled with unseen energy, and before him stood a figure cloaked in shadows, eyes like molten fire. Asterisk. "Who are you?" Kale asked. The figure did not answer. It raised its hand, and suddenly, Kale saw visions. He saw himself seated on the throne, a golden crown upon his head. Armies knelt before him, banners of Valastria flying high. Cities flourished under his rule, the world bending to his will. But then the vision shifted. The throne room was empty. The banners lay in tatters. The palace was silent, lifeless. And at the heart of it all, the flame burned, untouched, waiting. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the emptiness. Asterisk. "Power is not given. It is taken. And once taken, it must be fed." Kale gasped as the vision shattered. He stumbled back, his breath ragged, sweat beading on his forehead. Velen stood before him, his expression unreadable. "You saw something," the foreigner said. Kale nodded. "A vision of the future, of what could be. And now you understand," Velen said. "The flame does not curse, it reveals. But knowledge alone is not enough. If you wish to claim what is rightfully yours, you must be willing to act." Kale's heart still pounded from the vision, but the fear had faded. In its place, a hunger grew. He had seen his future, and he would stop at nothing to make it real. The hunger did not fade. Long after Kale had left the underground chamber, after he had returned to his chambers, and lay beneath the silk canopy of his bed, the vision burned within him. His mind replayed it over and over: the golden throne, the kneeling armies, the silent ruins. Asterisk. Power is not given. It is taken. And once taken, it must be fed. Sleep did not come that night. By dawn, Kale had made his decision. Velen was waiting for him in the eastern gardens, standing beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone pathways, but Velen seemed untouched by the light, his presence as cold and unshaken as the night before. "You've returned," Velen said without turning. Kale stepped forward. "I want to learn more." A faint smile touched the older man's lips. "I expected nothing less." Velen gestured for Kale to follow, leading him through a secluded path that wound deeper into the royal grounds. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, but Kale hardly noticed. His thoughts were fixed on what lay ahead. After several minutes, they reached a forgotten courtyard. Its stone walls cracked with age. A single brazier stood at the center, filled with a fire that did not flicker, did not shift in the wind. Velen stepped beside it. "Tell me, Kale, what do you believe power is?" Kale hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Strength, the ability to command, to shape the world according to your will." Velen nodded. A common answer, but incomplete. He reached into his cloak and produced a small silver knife. Without hesitation, he dragged the blade across his palm, allowing a few drops of blood to fall into the brazier. The fire hissed and flared, shifting from orange to an unnatural blue. "Power is not merely strength," Velen said. "It is understanding, sacrifice, control. The weak demand power as their right. The strong know it must be earned." Kale watched the fire twist and writhe, his pulse quickening. "You seek the flame," Velen continued, "but to wield its gifts, you must prove you are worthy." Kale stepped closer. "How?" Velen handed him the knife. "By offering something of yourself." Kale looked down at the blade. A simple cut, that was all. A few drops of blood. Nothing more. And yet, as he tightened his grip on the hilt, he felt the weight of something far greater pressing down on him. He thought of his father's warnings, of the stories whispered through generations, that those men had failed. They had been afraid. He was not. Kale drew the blade across his palm. Pain bloomed, sharp and quick, but he did not flinch. His blood dripped into the brazier, joining Velen's. The fire roared, surging upward, wrapping around his vision. Darkness closed in. Kale stood on the steps of the Tower of Eldoria. The sky above him churned with storm clouds. Yet the flame at the tower's peak burned steady, untouched by wind or rain. He ascended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The heat of the flame called to him, a voice without words, an unspoken promise of strength. But as he neared the summit, shadows took shape around him. Figures emerged from the darkness, kings and queens of old, their faces hollow, their eyes burning embers. They reached for him, their voices blending into a chorus of warning. Asterisk, turn back. Asterisk, it will take everything. Asterisk, you are not the first. You will not be the last. Kale clenched his fists. "I am not like you." The figures did not answer. Instead, they stepped aside, revealing the final stretch of the staircase. At the top, the flame awaited. Kale took another step, and the vision shattered. Kale gasped as he returned to the present. The courtyard fire had returned to normal, its blue glow fading into ordinary orange. His hand throbbed where he had cut it, but the pain was already dulling. Velen studied him. "What did you see?" Kale exhaled slowly. "The tower, the flame, the ones who came before me." "And did they stop you?" Kale shook his head. "They tried, A glimmer of satisfaction crossed Velen's face. Then you are ready for the next step? Kale looked down at his palm. The wound was shallow, but the mark it left on him was far deeper. This was only the beginning. King Altharion stood at the highest window of his palace, staring out over the kingdom he had ruled for 3 decades. The sun had barely begun to rise, painting the sky in hues of deep crimson and gold. Below, the streets of Eldoria were beginning to stir, merchants setting up their stalls, knights making their morning rounds. The city was alive, as it always was. And yet something felt wrong. He could not place it, but the feeling had been growing for weeks now, like a splinter buried too deep to remove. At first, he had ignored it. Kings did not have the luxury of paranoia. But now the unease gnawed at him with an intensity he could not dismiss. His mind drifted to his son. Kale had changed. At first, the difference had been subtle late nights spent in the library, a quiet restlessness in his demeanor. But now it was undeniable. His posture had stiffened. His gaze had sharpened. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried an edge. And his eyes. Altharion had seen those eyes before. They belonged to his father, King Varith, in the days before he vanished. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Enter. The door creaked open and Commander Dane stepped inside, his silver-plated armor gleaming in the morning light. A man of unwavering loyalty. Dane had been Altharion's most trusted knight for years. You summoned me, Your Majesty? Altharion turned from the window. There is something I need you to look into. Dane inclined his head. Of course. Altharion hesitated. He had always prided himself on being a just ruler, one who did not act on mere suspicion. And yet, it's about Prince Kale, he admitted. Dane's brow furrowed slightly, but he did not question. What concerns you, my king? He has been different, Altharion said, measuring his words carefully. More withdrawn, more secretive. I have noticed him slipping out of his chambers at odd hours, but no guards have seen where he goes. Dane considered this. Would you like me to question the palace watch? Altharion shook his head. No, I do not want rumors spreading. Not yet. Dane hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Then what would you have me do? The king's fingers tightened on the windowsill. Follow him. See where he goes, who he speaks to. I need to know what he is hiding. Dane placed a fist over his chest in salute. As you command, my king. As the commander turned to leave, Altharion exhaled slowly. He prayed he was wrong, but deep in his heart he knew. The dangerous flame had returned to his bloodline. Commander Dane moved through the palace halls with silent precision, his years as a soldier granting him an instinct for going unnoticed. The weight of the king's command sat heavy on his shoulders. To spy upon the prince, his future ruler, was a delicate matter. If Kale discovered him, the consequences could be dire. But the king had given an order, and Dane had sworn an oath. The palace was vast, its halls stretching like veins through the heart of Eldoria. The prince's chambers were in the eastern wing, near the high towers. But Kale had not slept there the past few nights. Servants whispered of his absence, yet none had seen him leave. That alone was troubling. Dane stationed himself near the corridor leading to Kale's chambers, blending into the dim torchlight. He did not have to wait long. Just past midnight, the door to the prince's chambers creaked open. Kale emerged, his figure wrapped in a dark cloak. He moved with purpose, his steps swift and certain. No hesitation, no caution, as if he did not fear being seen. Dane followed. The prince did not take the main halls. Instead, he wove through lesser-used corridors, slipping past the guards as if he had memorized their patrols. At last, he reached the hidden door tucked behind an old tapestry, one that Dane had never noticed before. Cale pressed his palm against the stone. A faint glow pulsed beneath his touch. The door clicked open. Dane's breath caught. Magic. The prince stepped inside, and before the door could shut, Dane slipped in after him, keeping his distance in the shadows. The passage was dark, the air thick with the scent of dust and ancient stone. It led downward, deeper than any place Dane had known to exist beneath the palace. His hand hovered over the hilt of his sword. Cale did not hesitate. He strode forward with confidence, as though he had walked this path many times before. The corridor widened, revealing a chamber lined with bookshelves, glowing crystals and symbols etched into the floor. At the center stood Velen. Dane's grip tightened on his sword. The foreigner, the one who had arrived at court only months ago, claiming to be nothing more than a wandering scholar. Yet here he was, waiting in the depths of the palace, in a place hidden from the king's eyes. "You are late," Velen said. Cale pulled back his hood. "I had to be careful." Velen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Caution is a sign of wisdom. You have done well." Cale stepped closer, and Velen gestured to a pedestal at the center of the room. Upon it burned a flame small, contained, yet unlike any fire Dane had ever seen. It did not flicker. It did not waver. It watched. Cale's eyes darkened with fascination. "What is this?" "A fraction of the power you seek," Velen said. "A lesson before the true test." Cale reached for the flame. Dane's pulse pounded. Asterisk, asterisk, this is sorcery. This is forbiddance. Asterisk, asterisk. For a single moment, he hesitated. Should he stop this now? Reveal himself? Or should he wait and gather more information? The decision would change everything. Dane could not stand idly by any longer. The king's suspicions, the foreign sorcerer, the prince's strange behavior, it all led to one conclusion. Cale had strayed too far, and Dane could not allow him to fall deeper into whatever dark path he was on. He stepped forward, his boots making a soft click against the stone floor. "Prince Cale," he called out, his voice stern and commanding. Cale's hand froze, inches from the flame. He turned slowly, his face blank at first, then narrowing with a flicker of recognition. "Dane?" Cale's voice was low, almost amused. "What are you doing here?" Velen stepped forward, his dark eyes meeting Dane's. "You should not have come, Commander." His voice was calm, but there was a threat beneath the surface, like a snake coiled and ready to strike. "I was following orders," Dane said, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his sword. "The king suspects you, Prince. He fears what you've become." "Fears?" Cale's lips curled into a smirk. "My father fears everything. He fears power. He fears change. And above all, he fears me." "Cale," Dane said, taking a step closer, his gaze hardening. "You don't know what you're playing with. This flame, it's not just some symbol of power. It's dangerous. Cale's expression darkened in an instant. He raised his hand sharply, and the air in the room seemed to grow thick, as though something ancient and forceful had awoken. "I am not afraid of danger," Cale snapped. This flame holds what my father has never had, what I deserve. Dane's heart hammered in his chest as Kel's eyes flickered toward the flame once more. The foreigner's presence grew more imposing with every passing moment. This was no longer just about the prince. This was about something much darker. You don't understand, Velen said, his voice colder now. The flame is not a gift. It is a burden. It can take everything from you, including your soul. I will take that risk, Kale replied, his voice firm. He turned his back to Dane and faced the flame once again, the light from it dancing across his features. Dane's grip on his sword tightened. This was no longer a matter of a prince. Straying from his path, this was something far worse. This was the very thing his king had feared. Without another thought, Dane rushed forward, drawing his sword in one fluid motion. "Step away from it, Prince," he commanded, the steel of his blade gleaming in the dim light. Kel's hand shot out faster than Dane could react, and in an instant, the air between them seemed to freeze. Dane found himself rooted to the spot, unable to move, as if an invisible force held him in place. Velen watched with calm amusement, his arms folded across his chest. "You're too late, Commander. Kale has already chosen his path. I will not allow this." Dane spat, his voice strained against the pressure in the air. "The king will know of this. You would betray your prince." Kale asked, his voice suddenly cold. "Do you truly think your loyalty will protect you? That your oaths will save you from what you don't understand?" Dane's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the power Kale was tapping into, the darkness pressing against his very soul. He could see it now, the transformation in Kel's eyes, the hunger in his heart. The prince was no longer the boy who had once been full of promise. Kale was becoming something else, something terrible. With one final effort, Dane gritted his teeth and reached deep inside himself, calling upon every ounce of strength he had. The pressure around him loosened, just enough to break free. He lunged forward, his sword raised high, ready to strike. Before the blade could reach its target, Kel's hand shot out again. This time, Dane was thrown back with such force that he slammed into the wall, his sword falling from his grasp. The air seemed to crackle with an energy Dane had never felt before. Kale turned slowly, his face a mask of both determination and wrath. "You would stop me. You would stand against me." Dane struggled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. His vision blurred, but he saw clearly enough to know that this was a battle he could not win. "Not if it means losing everything," Dane said through gritted teeth. Kale smirked. "Everything? You don't understand. Everything is what I'm willing to give." The flame behind him burned brighter, hotter, its unnatural light growing ever more intense. Dane took a step back, sensing that to push forward any longer would be his end. He had already seen enough to know that Kale was lost, consumed by something far greater than his desire for power. With a final, lingering glance at the prince, Dane backed away into the shadows, his heart heavy with dread. Kale was beyond saving. Dane stumbled back through the winding corridors of the palace, his thoughts a maelstrom of confusion and fear. His body ached from the force of the magic Kale had unleashed, but it was the image of the prince, his eyes burning with that dangerous light that weighed heavily on his mind. Kale had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just the crown prince of Eldoria, he was something else, something darker. And in that moment, Dane realized with chilling certainty, the flame had claimed him. He reached the king's chambers just as dawn's first light filtered through the tall windows. King Altharion was already awake, standing in front of his ornate mirror, his face taut with concern. The king had always worn his crown with grace, but tonight, something had changed in him as well. His brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a tight line. Dane entered without a word, his face pale, his body trembling with exhaustion. "Commander?" Altharion turned, his voice rough with worry. "What news of the prince?" Dane hesitated. The king had trusted him, but how could he tell him the truth? That his son, the one he had raised, the one who had once been so full of promise, was now consumed by an ancient and destructive power. "Your Majesty," Dane said, his voice strained, "Prince Kael is no longer the son you knew." Altharion's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? Where is he?" Dane stepped closer, his voice low. "He's taken something dangerous. A flame that is not merely fire, but a force of power, ancient and dark. It has changed him." The king's face paled, his eyes flickering with a flash of recognition. He turned away, as though he had just received a blow to the chest. "I feared this day would come," he muttered to himself, more to the air than to Dane. "The flame. It's always been in our bloodline." Dane frowned. "What do you mean, Your Majesty?" Altharion's shoulders sagged. "The flame is an old curse, one that has plagued our family for generations. My father, your ancestors, they all sought it, craved its power, only to be consumed by it. It was a force of destruction, a thing that could never be controlled. And now, Kael, my son, has fallen into the same trap." The weight of the king's words settled on Dane like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. "I should have known better," Altharion continued, his voice breaking. "I should have stopped him before it was too late." Dane looked up, his heart heavy. "What can be done, Your Majesty?" Altharion turned, his face resolute, but his eyes betrayed a deep sorrow. "I don't know. The flame has claimed us before. It's not something we can fight with steel or magic. It's a force of corruption, one that takes root in the soul. Once it has you, there's no turning back." Dane's mind raced. He had seen the power that Kael now wielded, the ease with which the prince had summoned it, and the cold, detached manner in which he had dismissed Dane's intervention. It was clear now Kael was not just after power. He was chasing something much more dangerous, the very essence of control over life and death. But there had to be a way to stop him. Kael stood alone in the hidden chamber beneath the palace, his hands trembling as they hovered over the flame. Its heat had become unbearable, but he was no longer afraid. The pain was nothing compared to the power it gave him. He had come so far. He had learned its secrets, tasted its truth, and now he understood. The flame was not just a weapon, it was a path to ultimate freedom, a path that few had the courage to follow. The echoes of the vision rang in his mind. Asterisk power is not given. It is taken. And once taken, it must be fed. Asterisk. Kael had fed the flame, and now it was feeding him. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fire. It did not burn him, it embraced him, its energy swirling around him, pulling him in. And in that moment, Kael knew that the fire would never abandon him. He could feel it, his father's presence, distant but unmistakable, as if the very walls of the palace were trembling beneath the weight of his fear. Kael smirked. Altharion would never understand. The king had always been too weak to accept. The truth that power could not be inherited. It had to be seized. And Kale would be the one to seize it. Kale stood motionless before the flame, his mind swimming in a haze of power and euphoria. The heat from the fire scorched his skin, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned closer, feeling the energy pulse through him, growing stronger with each passing moment. The flame whispered not in words, but in an ancient language that resonated deep within his soul. It spoke of kingdoms fallen, of empires risen, of mortals who had dared to wield its power, and of those who had been consumed by it. But Kale would not fall. He was different. He was strong enough to control it. With every second that passed, he could feel his very being becoming one with the flame. He no longer thought in terms of kingdoms, or even of his father's rules. All that mattered was the power that surged within him, the intoxicating knowledge that he could bend the world to his will. The past, present, and future were at his fingertips. He stepped back, finally breaking contact with the fire. His eyes glowed with a faint golden hue, an unsettling reminder of the unnatural force now coursing through him. Kel's breath was steady. He was in control, or so he thought. In the grand halls of Eldoria's palace, King Altharion stood alone in the throne room. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with the weight of his choices. He had spent years ruling with fairness and wisdom, guiding his people through both times of prosperity and hardship. But now, that very same wisdom was failing him. His son, his flesh and blood, was slipping away, drowning in a power that no mortal should possess. Dane had been clear in his report. Kale had already chosen his path, and that path led him away from everything the king had hoped for. Altharion had been hesitant to believe it, but deep within him, he knew the truth. Kale was beyond redemption. The flame had claimed him, just as it had claimed Altharion's father, and the king could feel the burden of that knowledge settling in his chest. But there was one thing he could not allow: for the flame to spread. Altharion turned to face the grand tapestry behind his throne. The image it portrayed was an ancient one depiction of the first monarchs of Eldoria, their faces full of pride and strength. The tapestry had been woven centuries ago, and it held secrets within its threads. One of those secrets had been passed down through the royal bloodline, a secret that Altharion had kept hidden for all these years, even from his son. The flame of Eldoria, as it was known, had been sealed away by his ancestors, locked in a hidden chamber beneath the palace. Only the king had the key, and only the king could unlock it. The flame could be extinguished, but only if it was sealed away once again, never to be used by those who craved its power. The time had come. Dane paced restlessly in his quarters, his mind racing with worry. The palace was a web of secrets and shadows, and every passing day seemed to stretch on endlessly. But tonight, something felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air and anticipation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The king had summoned him. He could not ignore the urgency in Altharion's voice. When he had called for him earlier, something was about to change, and Dane had a sinking feeling that it would not be for the better. The door to his chamber opened and a familiar figure stepped inside. "My lord," Dane said, bowing slightly. Altharion gave a weary nod, his eyes dark with the weight of his decision. "It is time, Commander. Time for us to act before Kel's descent is irreversible." Dane's heart sank. He had feared this. "Your Majesty," Dane began. "What do you mean?" What can we do? The prince is beyond saving, Altharion finished for him. His tone was heavy, but resolute. I should have stopped this long ago. But now, the flame has taken root in him, and if we don't act soon, it will destroy him and everything else with him. Dane swallowed hard. What do you need me to do, my king? Altharion turned to face him, his expression hardening. There is only one way to stop this, but it will not be easy. You must find the seal of Eldoria and take it to the heart of the flame. It will extinguish it, and with it, Kel's connection to the power that has consumed him. The seal of Eldoria? Dane asked, confused. But how? It was hidden away centuries ago. The only one who knows its location is you, my king. Altharion nodded solemnly. And I will guide you. But be warned. Once you activate the seal, there will be no turning back. The flame will lash out, and Kale will be no more. Dane's mind raced as he absorbed the king's words. The task seemed impossible, and yet it was the only option left. He had pledged his loyalty to the king, and now he would see it through, even if it meant facing the prince he had once sworn to protect. Night had fallen, and the kingdom was cloaked in darkness. The palace, once a beacon of strength and light, now seemed like a hollow shell, its corridors echoing with the weight of the choices yet to be made. Dane stood in the royal vault beneath the palace, the seal of Eldoria held tightly in his hand. The king had entrusted him with it, and now it was his burden to bear. He could feel the power of the seal thrumming within his palm, a constant reminder of the task ahead. The flames of the ancient fire beckoned in the distance, their light pulsing through the stone walls, guiding Dane toward his inevitable fate. Kale was waiting. Dane made his way through the winding corridors, his heart heavy with every step. The seal of Eldoria burned with a subtle, insistent heat in his hand, as if it sensed the importance of the task ahead. Every part of him had hoped that there might still be a way to reach. Kale to remind him of the goodness he once possessed, to remind him of the bond they had shared. But deep down, Dane knew that the prince was no longer the man he had known. The flame had consumed him, and only the seal could end it. The air grew thick as he approached the hidden chamber beneath the palace. The flickering glow of the flame from within cast strange shadows on the walls, making the entire room feel alive. Kale stood at the center of it all, his eyes gleaming with the unnatural light of the flame, his posture regal, but distant alien. His transformation was complete. The man who had once shown compassion and warmth now radiated cold power. Kale turned slowly, as though sensing Dane's presence before he spoke. "You've come." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something that seemed to vibrate with the energy of the flame. To stop me, no doubt. To end what you don't understand. Dane swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the seal. Kale, you don't have to do this. You've already given so much of yourself to this power. Don't let it take you completely. Kale laughed softly, a sound that was both cruel and sad. You're too late. I've already crossed the line. I've seen what true power can be, Dane. You can't stop me. No one can. With a flick of his hand, the flame flared, its light growing more intense, casting an unnatural warmth throughout the chamber. It swirled around Kale like an extension of his own being, a force that seemed to feed on his every word. I found my purpose, Kale continued, his voice rising with the strength of the flame. I will not be a slave to weakness. to the limits of mortality. I will create my own destiny. Dane's heart clenched. This was the man who had once sought to protect his kingdom, to fight for justice. And yet, here he was, claiming the flame's power as his own, forsaking everything that had once mattered. You don't understand, Kale, Dane said, his voice breaking. Power like this, it doesn't give you freedom. It enslaves you. It destroys everything it touches: your soul, your heart, your humanity. Look at what you've become. Kel's face darkened, and for a moment, Dane saw the flicker of the prince he had known, the boy who had been unsure, who had sought guidance and wisdom. But that fleeting moment was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of someone who had made their choice. I have no regrets, Kale said softly, but the words were laced with finality. You should have known, Dane. The flame will never let me go, and I will never let it go. Dane's grip on the seal tightened. This was it. He could no longer wait for Kale to turn back. The prince was lost, and the only thing left to do was to save Eldoria from the darkness he had become. With a final breath, Dane stepped forward, holding the seal aloft. The ancient symbol began to glow with a blinding light, its power responding to the call of the flame. Kel's eyes widened in shock. No! Kale screamed, his hand reaching out as if to grasp the seal, to stop it from ending his reign. But it was too late. The light from the seal flared out, engulfing the room. The flame flickered wildly, as if fighting against the power, but it was no match for the ancient force that had been set in motion. The chamber shook with the intensity of the struggle. And then, with a sound like 1,000 echoes, the flame was extinguished. Kale fell to his knees, his body racked with pain, as the power he had so eagerly claimed was ripped from him. His once glowing eyes dimmed, and the unnatural force that had consumed him slowly receded. The room grew quiet again, save for the sound of Kel's labored breathing. Dane stood motionless, his heart torn. He had done what was necessary, but at what cost? The prince, the young man he had once sworn to protect, was gone. In his place was a broken shell, a man who had lost everything in his quest for power. For a long time, there was only silence. Then Kale, barely able to lift his head, spoke in a whisper. I was wrong. Wasn't I? Dane knelt beside him, the weight of everything pressing down on his chest. You were, Kale, but there is always hope. As long as we breathe, there is always hope for redemption. The prince's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing shallow. For a moment, it seemed as if he would fade into unconsciousness, or perhaps death. But then, with great effort, Kale turned his head slightly toward Dane. Tell my father. I'm sorry, Kale whispered, the words barely audible. Dane nodded solemnly. I will. In the days that followed, Eldoria began to heal. The flame, once a symbol of power and ambition, was sealed away forever. The hidden chamber where it had burned was closed, its doors locked by the king himself. No one would ever seek its power again. Kale, though broken, lived on. He was not the prince he had once been, but perhaps in time he could find the man he could still become. King Altharion stood by his side, not as a ruler above him, but as a father, who had lost and gained more than anyone could understand. As for Dane, he remained at the king's side, his loyalty unwavering. But now, more than ever, he understood the true cost of power. In the end, the flame had taught them all a lesson. Power, when sought without wisdom, will consume the seeker. But even in the deepest darkness, there is always the possibility of redemption. The pursuit of greatness is not about wielding power, but about knowing when to let go of it. True strength lies not in what one can take, but in what one is willing to give up. And so, Eldoria flourished once again, built not on the power of the flame, but on the strength of its people and the wisdom of those who had learned the hard lessons of their past.